I think when we're talking about empathy, we're really talking about coming alongside the student based on who they are, not based on what you want from them. As a teacher, you have the most power to disrupt any negative feelings or emotion or perspective a student might have and how they see themselves in your classroom in order to help them believe in themselves.
And yet some people think that being empathetic towards a student is actually just making excuses. And so by being empathetic towards a student, you're actually making excuses that they don't have to do that.
You want the learners to be able to differentiate between the negative or the challenging aspect of a subject than how they actually depict you as a teacher and how you show up.
Hey, welcome to the Learning Success Podcast, brought to you by Deo Mwano Consultancy. My name is David, and this is Deo.
Hey, this is Deo. I'm excited for our Learning Success Podcast.
Our goal is to support educators and drive student success. And today we're discussing the role of empathy. We're going to talk about some common misconceptions, and then we're also going to answer some common questions around learning differences, language barriers, and the completion of work. Deo, I think the first thing that would be good is for us just to set a base of what are we meaning when we're talking about empathy, especially as it pertains, of course, to the learning environment.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about empathy, we're really talking about coming alongside the student based on who they are, not based on what you want from them or what even the world or the community is saying the students should be. Really getting to know the students within their face value and understanding their situation and being able to meet them where they are. That's really what empathy is. And in terms of that, it's really just like what you learn through the understanding should drive how you engage, how you show up, in the consideration of when you think about the students and the various moving things that shapes their experience, that you are putting them at the forefront of how you depict them versus how you want to see them or whatever the expectation and standards that might be.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I was just thinking when you were talking that, really it's empathy is about approaching a student without these preconceived notions about what you think might, they might be like or they might be able to do, but really just learning and listening from them and understanding what it is that who they are and where they come from, what they're really capable of. A good question I think to start would be, why does that matter? Why can't we just teach math? Why can't we just, read this book? And why does empathy even matter to a classroom?
I think empathy is critical in a classroom because the various component that shapes the student's being also manifest in how they show up in your classroom. So if you don't have empathy or you don't create a space to display it, then it might prevent the student to even show up in a way that's more authentic to who they are. And because in learning, it's like the intersection of how a student engages and shows up in the learning space has a lot to do with how comfortable or safe they feel within the environment that they're in a classroom. And in order to help close that gap, how the student feels about how they think about how you think about them or how you see them is a great impact in that. And so if that's not there, then it's really left to the student's own willpower or strength or grit that they have to bypass all those moving parts. Because at the end of the day, there's so many different factors that contributes to a student experience. Yeah. But the one that's really most important is really the teacher's role in that. Because if a student to student yeah, everyone comes with their own ways, right? Like there might be some friction or there might be some picking or whatever, the different little things. But the teacher is the guiding principle within a classroom. Like it's your country. You're the leader of that sovereignty.
Yeah.
And what you do will go a long way. And I think for learners, depending on resiliency that they have or how they view themselves or what kind of empowerment they feel being in your classroom will determine a lot about how they show up. And I think as a teacher, you have the most power to disrupt any negative feelings or emotion or perspective a student might have and how they see themselves in your classroom in order to help them believe in themselves. And for a lot of the work that I've done, even with a lot of EL students, English learners, outside of the classroom environment at an after-school program where you get to see how they engage in from an academic standpoint or even from a social standpoint through sports and extracurriculum, I've learned so much. I was involved with this amazing program in the local town here where I live. For for 13 years. And we worked with 4th grader all the way up to 12th graders. And many of the students were English learners from all over the world. And something that sticks to me, definitely even now, years and years later, is the fact that anytime their teachers would come to our program, they would say, "Oh my gosh, is this the same student?" This student in my classroom, they never talk or they never participate, never engage, never volunteer. And I've just seen this same student here in this program for the last couple of minutes. They're vibrant. They have a lot of energy. They're expressing themselves. Like, it would be great to see that side of them at our school too. And I would hear this very frequently from numerous of teachers, sometimes even administrators that came to visit the program. And I would always say, well, it's about safety, comfortability, and the space has been created for them to see themselves, for them to fully express. And sometimes the students were still fairly new to the States. So it's not that their English got better but there was something about the space that this after school program created that allowed students to feel comfortable to just be them. So I tell that story because I think teachers can also do that in their classroom. You can set the intention and demonstrate, come alongside, show. A lot of those behaviors are what students receive and how they see you as a teacher and how they see themselves and what it means for them to participate and engage in the classroom. And so empathy is so critical.
Yeah, I mean, it's the basis of everything. I think just as humans, I think we feel so isolated a lot of times, and we just want someone to just, connect with, that we feel. And it's amazing how that confidence can come out when you have someone else who's going along that journey with you. And the opposite, obviously, of not people not judging you, because we're always judging ourselves, or society might be judging us, and and we can, by being empathetic, we can break those barriers down and have students feel, like you mentioned, that trust, and really that's the basis of then them believing in themselves and being more of what they are inside, and letting that really show, and really letting that be. Let's talk about some common misconceptions, because I think that empathy is so important in education. I really think that it is key. And yet some people think, here's a myth, that being empathetic towards a student is actually just making excuses. And so by being empathetic towards a student, you're actually making excuses that they don't have to do that. How do you address that myth that empathy is actually just allowing, people to be weak, or just
being lenient, right?
Yeah.
Compromising.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I do have to say, so I always like to be very transparent on both sides, because I do feel like sometimes folks might not know how to be empathetic, but also still uphold whatever the standards are, or the principles, or the beliefs and vision or mission of the classroom, the school. The unfortunate part is sometimes it does happen where folks don't really know how to enforce, keep accountability, but at the same time show love and grace.
Yeah.
Or
it's a difficult
show
dance.
humility. But empathy doesn't supposed to compromise those other things.
Right.
Because if you compromise those other things, it might actually, on the long term, it might be detrimental for the student in their development. Because the doing and the being is two different things, but they coincide with one another, right? So the doing is, if there's any, let's say there's some sort of a formula or a process that's being presented to a student, and the formula or the process might be intricate or rigorous, and the student might not have some foundational knowledge around it because of various reasons, right? Depending on different gaps the student might have in order to fulfill it.
Yeah.
The opportunity is on identifying what's causing that gap to occur, and then figuring out how do you help the student build capacity in order for them to build the strength and get acquainted and finding ways to acquire those knowledge and demonstrate it.
Right.
That's you can't compromise on that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, from an empathetic standpoint, understanding who the student is will help you understand what those drivers are. And I talk a lot about this in many of our learning success podcasts in regard to the experience that I had for almost 5 years developing a coaching model for adult learners, and really understanding all the different moving parts different learners have, and how sometimes their own negative self-taught or negative perspective that they might have around a subject might not even be true to their ability or their capabilities, or giving themselves even a chance.
Yeah.
Deters them from being able to have a chance to compete, right? Whatever that means. So a good teacher knows the balance of showing grace, but also pushing the student, but not pushing the student from an aggressive standpoint than it is from making connection to whatever the thing that might be relevant to the learner. Yeah. And the only way you can learn about something that's relevant to the student is by getting to know the student. And how do you get to know the student is by spending time and showing curiosity. All of those things, listening, right? Active listening. All of those things are components of empathy. And so if you have that, it will allow you to figure out how can you still work alongside the student without compromising whatever rigor is or the standards. And I think you're not doing the student favor if you just compromise by saying, well, because of this deficiency or because of this barrier or because of this gap, we're just going to lower the standard then just to get you by. In certain occasion, depending on the student, if there is indeed developmental challenges or whatever it is, then you got to figure out what the right size are, right?
Sure.
But it still doesn't compromise, the standard itself.
Exactly. Yeah. The goal itself may be different, but you still have a level of rigor, whatever that goal.
Oh, 100%. And I also think that there's a difference between what's fulfilling the being and what's fulfilling the doing. Some students might need companionship. They might need to feel and know that, hey, there's an administrator in this school or a teacher in this school that believes in me. Right? That cares about me. Right? And that might go a long way in their identity and how they navigate their everyday experience at the school. So it's never either or. But then there are certain situations where, regardless of where the student is, they might already be in a different mindset regarding how they depict school or depict their experience within your school building. But that still doesn't mean that you don't show respect to that student, right? You don't uplift them. You don't acknowledge them, right? If you see something they have or something that they're doing that's positively impacting the community. You can still acknowledge that. It doesn't take away the fact that you're like, oh, yeah, that student hasn't passed their homework.
Right.
Because I've actually seen this in the classroom experience with different projects they've done, where some teachers might even become agitators, right? Because that student already has a label. That's so-and-so who does this, or that's so-and-so who gets like 5 million detention every week, right? So you start looking at the student based on the label than the student themselves. Yes, it doesn't justify the negative things that they're doing that's preventing the student to either be a good citizen in the school or being a good worker. But that still doesn't necessarily mean that that's the label that you start calling that student, right?
Right.
And I'm sure you've seen this in your experience.
Absolutely.
As a teacher. So I know I went off a little bit on that, but I do think that there's the myths are on both sides, and it's important to be able to come alongside a student and show them the way and not compromise the rigor, but at the same time still showing up in a way that it's compassionate, shows humility, shows grace. And at the end of the day, it helps the students to know that that person has my back or that person believes in me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that empathy and that rigor, that's why we want to have that empathy, is to get them to that goal. It does, I think, on the teachers, on the teacher side, it does require a lot of thought and a lot of time and a lot of energy to say, where am I at here, and where do I need a little more, a little more concentration, because that there is a little bit of a dance there of like, do I need to provide more supports, or do I need to provide more, more motivation, whatever that might be in terms of the student. But I think that motivation, or that empathy is really, really important. And I think, I was just thinking about my own experience as a teacher when you were saying that. I can't tell you how many times at the beginning of a school year a teacher would come to me and say, oh, I had so-and-so last year, and would start, and I would just have to say, I'm sorry, I'd rather not hear that. And then on the flip side, at the end of the year, I'd have other teachers that would say, oh, so-and-so was such a troublemaker in my class or whatever. And it was like, kind of like what you were saying about your after school program, about, I didn't have that experience at all. And I think it was all due to the fact of that, that empathy and that just understanding where the student was at. And then that actually aided in taking the student to farther than, beyond those labels that we had put on, that other teachers perhaps had put on students, and then they sort of just grow into those labels and kind of breaking out of those, Well, let's talk about some of these. We have some frequently asked questions, and these are just some different kind of scenarios and that ways that empathy kind of comes up. And here's our first one. How can educators accommodate diverse learning styles and abilities to ensure that all students can succeed?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think it's actually really critical to be able to identify how your student learns, like the process they take in order to capture information, digest the information, and then articulate the information. And I'm going to make a reference again to the coaching work that I did with adult learners, because they were remote and we had the back end access to the learning management that they were using where the curriculum was being run. We could see a lot of the modularized behavior, meaning, so if someone logged in, if they clicked on this a particular resource, what we didn't see in the data was what they acquired from reading the resources,
right,
where their curiosity went. So in our work, we would ask the student, hey, I noticed that you clicked on that resource. Have you had a chance to read it? Like, oh yeah, I have. What's your takeaway? So already I would have the resource open on my end in the system. So as they're telling me what they've learned, it's pretty easy to see on the system what the resource is. So I'll say, hey, what did you find fascinating?
Yeah.
What did you find that you found yourself curious on?
Mm-hmm.
Was this new information? Have you ever learned this before? What did you find challenging and interesting, right?
Yeah.
So as they're unpacking that, like, it tells me so much about how they are encountering the information, and their reflection of their process is also telling me a lot about their learning model, their learning ways. And said, hey, so with the adult learners, you would hear some of the students say, hey, I'm a type of person that likes to, once I'm done reading something, I got to find somebody to tell them what I've learned. And it helps me retain the information. So I'm like, boom. Yeah. So in my head, I'm like, oh, this person needs to regurgitate what they're learning.
Yeah.
So then I'll say, hey, are you highlighting stuff? Are you taking notes? How do you retain the stuff? Oh, no, I just read it. And I'm kind of a memorizing type of person. So once I memorize it, I have to say it. Mm-hmm. Once I say it, then it's stuck. And I'm like, okay, this. So, and that doesn't really happen very often. Sometimes I feel like in school, we were forced to take that approach because we were learning coaches. So anytime a student got stuck, you wanted to know, where are they stuck?
Right.
Are they stuck because they didn't do the work? Are they stuck because they're not understanding the resources? Are they stuck because they don't know how to put the deliverables together? I had students that knew all the requirements, but just didn't understand the deliverable.
Yeah.
You know, what the deliverable required. So then it was much easier for me to walk them, to put all the other stuff aside, because I knew for sure they know the content, they're struggling with the direction and the deliverable. So then I would ask, well, if it was up to you, how would you show it? Yeah. So then they would tell me, well, I'll do this. I'll make a video, and the video will show this. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. So there's so many amazing experience that sometimes educators miss around the learner's approach. Right. And sometimes along the way, as you're unpacking the learner's approach, you will also learn about the approach, the aspect of the approach where they might not be maximizing on because they rely so much on the retention. Yeah. But they don't really have an outlet to display it, right? Yeah. Or to articulate it, demonstrate it. So then you're like, hey, what if you, after you take it, if you just stood in front of a camera, pretended like you're doing a presentation to yourself for a couple of minutes, talking through. Mm-hmm. Oh, I've never done that before. I'm gonna try it, and then boom, they do it. And then and for a lot of the learners that we worked with, some of their project was video based. They can do video based. Mm-hmm. So that was another way for me to help some of the learners to overcome their fear of being in front of a camera. Right. So I'll say, hey, that's the video. It's just gonna be between you and I. You'll send it to me. And once they've gone through the process, I'm like, you just did the entire assignment. Yeah. Oh my gosh, you're so right, right? So part of it, I think it's really important to understand how a student acquires information, demonstrates it, and all those little intricacy of how they go about. And sometimes you have to take the student outside of the classroom experience. So my thing is always like, hey, what do you spend a lot of your time doing on YouTube? When was the last time you learned something new? What was it for? What made you want to learn the thing? How did you go about it? Right. So as they're telling me this, they're giving me all the game around their learning process. Yeah. Right. And I think some of those practices needs to be included in the education space, because the way that people learn about something that they're passionate about might be very different in how they go about learning about something that's mandatory to them. Yeah. And as you unpack, you will learn a lot about the approach that they take. So some folks might say, hey, I paused, I went back, or I took a bunch of screenshots of certain aspect of the tutorial, and I just use it as a reference. And you're like, oh, snap, that's a visual learner, right? So it's like, anyway, so I'm giving some free, that is some free game right there. We can probably, over time, I got really good at learning how to kind of help a student hack their learning approach. Yeah. Because some of this stuff they just did in autopilot, but they didn't really recognize that that's actually the methodology of learning that works really well for them. But they viewed it more of like, hey, I love to play the guitar and I'm going up learning different chord on YouTube. But when you start unpacking the process, you're like, oh, this was actually the piece that was critical for you. That's how you remember. That's how you went back to it.
Yeah.
So anyways, I kind of went off on that, but just wanted to give some context.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In the minute that we have left, for educators, can you give your top tips for someone who they want to be more empathetic? What do they do? How do they do that?
It starts with the mindset that you come into the relationship or the engagement with. What's driving your mindset and your perspective of your student? The reality is there's a lot of negative intent that we have as teachers at times. And some of that is not, it might not even be driven by what your students are doing. It might just be who you are as a person, what makes you tick at times, right? And I think by really having that introspective will allow you to identify, are those things that I'm bringing in positive, uplifting the spirit of my students, creating an opportunity for my students to know that there's an ally on the other end, right? That person that's standing up in front of the classroom every day, the person that sends an email out asking for assignments, that person that's monitoring your quiz and tests, that person is an ally. That person is not an antagonist. And if you're intentional by identifying it, one, and then finding the right words to position your intentions to your students, and then coming alongside them to demonstrate what your intentions are, they will know, and it will make an impact.
Absolutely.
Because the ultimate is you want a student to be able to say, Professor Billick, the subject that he teaches is so hard and tough, but I always feel like Professor Billick is always listening, always creates time, right? Always finds a way to make connection, right? Like, that stuff is coming out of your empathetic behaviors, various of characteristics that you're displaying that's reflecting it. And that's the sweet spot. You want the learners to be able to differentiate between the negative or the challenging aspect of a subject than how they actually depict you as a teacher and how you show up.
Right. I always say, man, that was really, really difficult, and we did it. Like, we got there. Absolutely.
And I guess the last thing I would also say is just normalizing the challenge. I feel like sometimes as teachers, we're so quick to try to paint a picture that's positive or easy, non-difficult, because we want to invite the learner into the process, maybe setting a more happier or less challenging expectation. I would actually challenge that. I think it's important to be able to call out the tough and the hard part of the class or the content or the subject, and then help the students to understand that part of the journey is going to be navigating this various aspect of whatever the topic is. But there's resources to help to walk you alongside, and maybe even calling out challenging aspect of it that others have experienced and how they've walked through it. Or if it's even your own story when you were in college or in high school or whatever, if you found yourself struggling with it, or if you didn't find yourself struggling with it, making connection to other folks' experience. And because when you normalize the difficulty and the challenges, then it sets a more realistic expectation that yes, it is going to be challenging. Yes, it's going to take time, but there's tools and resources to help walk alongside you. And you can be empathetic by saying, hey, I know there's going to be times where you're going to feel frustrated, you're going to feel angry, but I want you to know I'm going to be here to support you because I've dealt with the same thing with many students that have come across this class. And we're going to walk through it together, right? So normalizing the difficulties and the challenges and having a plan of action, you're just setting a map for the students to walk into that challenge.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us for today. If you found something helpful, please subscribe, share with a colleague, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thank you, David.